Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now we begin. Do you believe in ghosts? The question came out of nowhere, breaking the silence of the night. My hand froze over the clipboard, the sound of my pen scraping across the paper ringing far too loudly in the empty room. There it was again, that strange creak, almost like footsteps. I glanced toward the door, expecting to see someone there, but it was just the dim glow of the old factory lights casting long shadows across the narrow hallway. No one was supposed to be here. No one was here. I wasn't sure why I asked myself that question. Maybe it was the long hours of solitude, or the fact that I was the only one left in this decaying factory. It had been years since the last worker clocked out for the last time, and now I was left, the lone night watchman. The plant used to hum with life, machines clattered, workers bustled about, but now it was just me, the walls, and the quiet, too quiet. I could still hear the hum of the past, though, if I closed my eyes long enough. I always thought I'd be okay with solitude. I had gotten used to the sound of the factory at night. The creaking of metal and the deep rumbles from old machines were nothing new. But lately something had changed. Something felt off. The sounds seemed louder, closer, as if the factory itself was alive, breathing with a strange energy, waking up in the night. I adjusted my cap and walked slowly across the cold concrete floor. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting an eerie glow that seemed to stretch the shadows further than they should go. There was a chill in the air, and the old heater on the wall hadn't worked properly in months. The feeling of being watched returned, and I couldn't shake the sensation that someone was in the room with me. The factory was large. There were two main sections, separated by an aisle of abandoned workstations, rusty filing cabinets, and cracked windows. The sound of my boots echoed too loudly in the emptiness as I made my way down the corridor toward the east wing. I passed by the old assembly line, still covered in dust, but it was as if the machines had frozen in time, frozen in place. The conveyor belts were stuck midway, like a forgotten dream. Then there it was again. A heavy step. Not from me. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart thudding in my chest. The air seemed to grow thicker, like the factory itself was holding its breath. I stood still, listening, waiting. But there was nothing now, just silence. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. It was nothing. Just the old building settling, I told myself. The beams and metal frames creaked and groaned in the wind. That's all. Yet even as I convinced myself of that, the nagging feeling didn't disappear. In fact, it grew stronger. I glanced at the clock on the wall. The time was nearing 2 in the morning. Another 3 hours to go before my shift ended. Another 3 hours in this unsettling silence. My flashlight flickered as I shone it across the hallway, its beam cutting through the dark. The light settled on the large, industrial doors at the end of the hall. They were ajar just slightly. They hadn't been like that when I walked past earlier. My stomach nodded. I took a deep breath. It's nothing, I whispered to myself, but the words felt weak in the air. Carefully I approached the doors, the faint sound of my breath and the click of my flashlight the only sounds I could hear now. As I pushed the door open, a gust of cold air hit my face, and the hairs on my neck stood up. The room beyond was pitch dark. I couldn't see a thing, and yet there was something about that darkness that felt like it was watching me. I stepped inside, my footfalls muffled against the thick, dust-covered floor. As I moved further into the room, I heard it again, the sound of a footstep just behind me. I spun around, heart racing. Nothing. The door was still wide open, and I could hear the faint hum of the machinery from the next room, but there was no one there. I looked at the hallway leading back to the security office. It was empty still, but something felt off about that darkness, like it was waiting for me. I couldn't explain it. There was just a presence now, thick and suffocating. I shook my head. I'm just tired, I thought. Maybe it was just my nerves getting to me. The walls of the factory were closing in on me. The silence, once comfortable, now felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I turned back to the dark room in front of me, and that's when I noticed it, the faintest flicker of light, barely perceptible, coming from the far corner of the room. I didn't know what to think. It wasn't a good light, not like the hum of the factory's overhead bulbs. This one was wrong. It flickered like a flame fighting against the wind. I walked toward it, my steps slow and deliberate. There was no sound now, just the faint buzzing of my flashlight and the increasing pounding of my heart. I had to know what it was. I had to know if I was losing my mind. The closer I got, the more the room seemed to change. The shadows stretched longer. The air grew colder. And then the light flickered, and for just a moment I saw it. A figure. It was tall, thin, and misshapen, like a human shape, but not quite. The faint light made it hard to see, but I could tell it was moving toward me. I froze. The figure wasn't walking. It was gliding, floating toward me. It was then that the first real rush of panic hit me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. No answer, just the steady, unnatural flickering of the light and the sound of my own pulse in my ears. I took a step back. Then everything went black. The darkness swallowed me whole. For a moment I thought I had passed out, lost consciousness from the fear, the adrenaline. My hands trembled and I blinked, struggling to adjust to the sudden blackness. It was as though the very air had thickened around me, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. My flashlight had gone out, leaving me in complete darkness, and for a moment I just stood there, frozen. Then came that sound. It wasn't the soft click of my flashlight falling to the ground. No, it was the distinct scraping of metal against metal. The noise was faint, but it was unmistakable. The sound of something dragging. Something heavy. I turned my head slowly, trying to locate the source of the noise in the pitch-black room. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my feet wouldn't move. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was no one here. Or at least that's what I thought. I was alone, I had to be. "Hello," my voice was a weak tremor, barely louder than a whisper. It didn't carry far in the thick air. I waited, but there was no response. Only silent. A chill crept over my skin as the sound intensified, growing louder. The dragging noise seemed to get closer, a slow, methodical motion that sent a wave of nausea through me. It was like the sound of metal scraping across concrete, dragging on the floor behind me. I twisted around, expecting to see something, anything. But the space was empty, dark, and oppressive. The shadows that clung to the walls seemed to shift with an unnatural fluidity, stretching out toward me like fingers. I clenched my fists, trying to steady myself. This isn't real. It can't be real, I whispered under my breath. My voice felt distant, as if it didn't belong to me anymore. But even as I told myself that, the dread crept deeper into my bones. Something was in here. Something that didn't belong. I took a step forward, trying to move toward the door. The dragging noise stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence behind it. A breath caught in my throat as I moved again, this time faster, desperate. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat ringing in my ears. The room seemed to close in on me. The walls felt like they were moving, warping. I couldn't tell if it was my mind playing tricks on me or if the space itself was alive. Then another sound. This one was different. A faint, almost imperceptible hum, like a machine powering on in the distance. The hum echoed through the factory, soft but growing, building up in the darkness. The sound wasn't right, something felt off about it. It had a rhythm to it, an unnatural pulse that made my stomach turn. I forced myself to move again. The door was just a few steps away. The exit. I could make it. I had to make it. But as I approached, I noticed something else. There in the corner of the room where the light flickered was a faint outline. It was still hard to make out the shape, but it was there. A shadow. But it was wrong. Too tall. Too thin. And it was standing perfectly still, watching. My blood ran cold. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart hammering in my chest. The figure, whatever it was, hadn't moved. But somehow I knew it was aware of me. It was staring, waiting. I was paralyzed. The fear was crushing, like a weight pressing on my chest. My eyes darted around, but the room seemed to be growing smaller, the shadows longer, the air thicker. I couldn't breathe. My body refused to obey. I couldn't look away from the figure. And then it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it took a step toward me, its long limbs shifting unnaturally. The sound of its movement was faint, like the rustling of fabric, but it was too close now. The flickering light illuminated the shape briefly, and that's when I saw it. Its face, or what should have been its face, was obscured, a void, just an empty space where eyes should have been. The darkness inside it seemed to swallow everything around it. I gasped, stumbling back. But my legs couldn't carry me. I was caught, trapped in the oppressive weight of the darkness and the figure before me. "Stay away," I shouted, my voice breaking through the terror. But it didn't stop. The figure was coming closer, its movement deliberate, purposeful. In a panic, I grabbed for something, anything. My hands found the old metal pipe leaning against the wall, one of the few things that hadn't been moved in years. I gripped it tightly, trying to steady my shaking hands. But even with the makeshift weapon, I knew it wouldn't matter. Nothing would stop it. Nothing would stop them. I raised the pipe in front of me, heart racing as the figure took another slow, impossible step forward. My breath came in shallow gasps. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. And then suddenly the figure stopped. It stood there just a few feet from me. I could feel the presence of it, cold and suffocating, pressing against me. There was no sound now. No scraping metal, no hum of machines. Just the heavy, oppressive silence. My throat felt tight. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure tilted its head slightly, as though considering me, studying me. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. It didn't move like a person. It didn't feel like a person. I heard something then, something softer than before. A whisper, faint and indistinct. It seemed to come from all around me, from within the shadows themselves. The voice didn't sound like a voice at all. It was a low hum, a murmur, like something ancient and forgotten, calling out to me. Before I could react, the light flickered again, faster now, more erratic. In the brief flashes, the figure's shape seemed to distort. It stretched unnaturally, its limbs elongating, its body twisting in a way that no human body should. My vision blurred and I felt dizzy, as though the room was spinning around me. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the flickering stopped. And the figure was gone. I stood there in the dark, gasping for air, my heart still racing. My knees felt weak, and I could barely stand. I didn't know how long I had been frozen, how long it had been since the figure disappeared. It felt like time had stretched, bending in on itself. But it was gone. Whatever it was gone. And yet, I could still feel its presence. It was still here. I had to leave. I had to get out of this place. But I couldn't trust myself. My legs wouldn't move. My body was paralyzed by the fear that had taken root in me. Was it real? I asked myself over and over again. Or was I losing my mind? But as I stood there, alone in the dark, I couldn't deny the truth any longer. Something was still here. Something I couldn't see. And it wasn't leaving. I don't know how long I stood there, motionless, my heart thudding in my chest like a drum. The silence was suffocating. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of everything. The air was thick, like it was pressing against my skin, and the shadows seemed to shift and pulse around me. I could feel them watchful, like eyes hidden in the dark corners of the factory. My mind raced. Was it real? I wanted to scream, to shout out loud, but the words got caught in my throat. The fear was too strong. I felt trapped, paralyzed, in a place that had once felt so familiar to me. But now this factory was a nightmare. I took a trembling step forward, trying to move toward the door. Each movement felt slow, weighted, as if the very space around me was resisting my escape. I thought I could hear something, a faint whisper, maybe a murmur. It was coming from behind me, just beyond my reach. I spun around, flashlight flicking back on as I searched the shadows. The beam of light sliced through the thick darkness, revealing only the same still, empty room. But it wasn't empty, not really. Something was there. Something I couldn't see, but I could feel. It was as if the walls themselves were watching me. The factory, once a place of industry, of work in motion, now felt alive, wrong. It felt like it had a heartbeat of its own. A low, throbbing pulse that was felt more than heard. And it was growing faster. A strange vibration rippled through the floor beneath my feet, followed by the subtle hum of machinery. I hadn't heard that sound in years. The factory's engines, long silent, were stirring again. But why now? My stomach twisted as I stared at the wall across from me, where the faded outline of an old control panel was barely visible. The vibration deepened, a low hum reverberating through the concrete and steel of the factory. I couldn't escape the feeling that the factory itself was alive, that the walls were breathing, moving around me. I took another shaky step forward. The movement was so slow that it felt unnatural, like my feet were being pulled toward something. My breath quickened, my hands clammy, my heart hammering as the sound grew louder. The factory was waking up piece by piece, and I couldn't escape it. I reached for the door. My hand shook as I touched the cold metal handle, but before I could turn it, the sound stopped. All at once, the factory was quiet again, but the silence felt different. It was more oppressive, more suffocating. My breath hitched in my throat. It felt like something was waiting, watching, listening, and then out of nowhere, a deep thud reverberated through the walls. The sound was heavy, as though something immense had just shifted inside the building. I whipped around, my flashlight scanning the room frantically, but there was nothing. No movement, no figures, just the still, empty space. I was losing my mind. I turned back to the door. I have to get out. No. But as I grasped the handle, the noise came again. This time it was unmistakable. A low, rhythmic pounding. Like a heartbeat. But it wasn't from the floor or the walls, it was coming from the ceiling. A heavy, unnatural thump in perfect sync with my pulse. I looked up and my breath caught in my throat. The ceiling was black far above, but I could see something. A dark shape moving slowly, like it was shifting across the beams. My skin prickled with dread. I couldn't make out the details, couldn't see what it was, but I could feel it. It was moving closer. Without thinking, I ran. I didn't care about the door anymore. I just needed to get away from whatever was up there, whatever was moving in the darkness above me. My footsteps were loud in the silent factory as I bolted down the hallway, but each step felt like it brought me no closer to safety. The air grew colder the further I ran, a sharp chill creeping down my spine. Why was I running? I asked myself the question as my body propelled me forward. The walls seemed to close in around me. The shadows twisted into strange shapes, watching me, always watching. I could hear my own breath, shallow and ragged, and the pounding in my chest was deafening. I turned a corner sharply, but when I looked ahead, I saw it. The hallway was longer than before. The walls stretched out into infinity. The factory, it seemed, was shifting, changing. The space was warping, twisting in on itself. The more I ran, the further away the exit seemed. I could feel the presence behind me, but I didn't dare turn around. I didn't want to see it. Whatever it was close. I could feel its eyes on me. The low thudding continued, now echoing in my ears. My heartbeat raced faster, matching the rhythm of the sound. It was inescapable. I stumbled, tripping over something on the floor, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The sound was deafening now, each thud vibrating through the floor, through my body. I was losing my mind, and yet I couldn't stop. I could feel it, whatever it was, getting closer. I could feel its breath on my neck, cold and heavy. The air around me was thick, as though it was filled with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. I reached the end of the hallway and slammed into a door, but it wouldn't open. My hands were slick with sweat as I tried to twist the handle. The door wouldn't budge. The pounding continued, louder now, right behind me, and the walls seemed to close in. I was trapped. I turned, breathing heavily, the flashlight flickering weakly in my hands. My heart was hammering against my ribs. The darkness in front of me seemed to ripple, like a surface disturbed by something unseen. And then I saw it. A figure. Dull. Then it moved with an unnatural, jerky gait, like it didn't quite belong in this world. Its face, or what should have been its face, was just a black void, empty and hollow. The figure was staring at me, but there was no recognition in its gaze. It was as if it had no understanding of what I was, of who I was. It took a slow step forward, and then another. And another. My body screamed for me to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. The factory had taken everything from me, the warmth, the comfort, the safety. Now it was taking my mind. The shadows crept closer, whispering things I couldn't understand, filling the space with words I couldn't quite hear. And all the while, the heartbeat in the walls grew faster. Louder, stronger. I wasn't alone. The factory wasn't empty. And I wasn't going to survive this. The figure moved closer. I could hear the sound of its footsteps, but it wasn't the sound of feet on concrete. No, it was deeper, heavier, like something much larger, something that didn't belong in the small confines of the factory. The rhythm of its movement, synchronized with the thudding of my own pulse, made my head swim. Each step it took felt like an eternity, and every inch closer to me was an unbearable weight pressing against my chest. I backed away, my legs refusing to work properly. I wasn't even sure if I was moving or if the floor was shifting beneath me. The shadows in the room twisted and elongated, crawling along the walls like living things, reaching for me, pulling me deeper into the heart of the factory. The air, thick with the smell of rust and decay, clung to my skin. Get out now. The command echoed in my mind, but my body was frozen in place. The figure wasn't moving like a human. It was jerky, unnatural, as if it wasn't used to walking at all. Its limbs, too long, too thin, glistened in the dim light, an oily sheen to its skin. I didn't dare look at its face again. I couldn't. The emptiness of its gaze, the void where a face should have been, was enough to make my heart stop. But I knew it was watching me. I could feel it. That cold, insidious presence. I stumbled backward, desperate for something to cling to. My hands grazed the walls, the rough, pitted concrete scraping my skin. The entire factory felt like it was alive in ways that didn't make sense. The building groaned under some unseen weight, its metal beams creaking like bones. And then I heard it, the sound of machinery. A low whirring that gradually grew louder. The hum of gears, of belts spinning, of old machines coming back to life. The sound that had once been familiar to me, the sounds of industry, was now twisted and alien. It was as though the factory itself was stirring, awakening, reacting to the figure that was closing in on me. The figure reached out, its long, gnarled fingers stretching toward me. They moved with unnatural speed, brushing the air with a sound like dry leaves. I backed away, but the room seemed to stretch further than I could run. I could feel its cold breath on my skin, though it wasn't breathing. It didn't need to. I swung my flashlight wildly, illuminating nothing but more darkness. My mind was fraying, my thoughts tumbling over one another, each one drowning the next. Is this real? Is this a nightmare? But the sensation, the presence of something so wrong, so impossibly wrong, was too tangible. I could feel it in my bones. My eyes darted to the machines that were flickering to life. They weren't turning on in any orderly fashion, like a machine might in a factory being restarted. No, this was different. They were sparking erratically, their movements jerky and unstable. There were flashes of light, blinding flashes, that sent jagged shadows slicing across the walls. A screech echoed through the room as a conveyor belt lurched into motion, dragging something across it with a terrible grinding noise. I could hear the factory as if it were alive, the walls shuddering, the floors vibrating underfoot, and the distant, mechanical hum that grew louder with every passing second. And in the distance there was a faint, distorted sound. It was faint, but it sent a chill crawling up my spine. It was a voice I recognized. But how could it be? It was his voice. Gary. Gary was one of the men who had worked here. He was one of the men who had disappeared, the last shift before the factory had closed down. I didn't remember him being the type to leave without notice, but his name was all but forgotten, his memory buried under dust and time. And yet here it was, his voice warped and crackling, screaming through the walls of this decaying place. The sound was like a radio that couldn't quite find the right frequency, static cutting through his words. Don't go, not safe, stay away. The voice was garbled, but there was no mistaking it. Stay away. I barely understood the warning, my mind too fogged with terror to grasp what was happening. The thumping in my chest was deafening now, but this wasn't just fear. Something was happening. The machines were running, the walls were closing in, and the air was thick with something that smelled faintly of rot and metal. And then the truth hit me like a bolt of lightning. This place, this factory wasn't empty. It wasn't abandoned. The workers never left. Gary's voice faded in and out, but there was something more than just the echoes of the past, something more than just memories trapped inside these walls. I remembered the stories the older men had told, how some of them had been here long enough to know every corner of the factory like it was their own skin. Some places don't forget, they had said, chuckling nervously as they wiped their brow with the back of their hand. Some places keep what they've lost. They used to joke about the machines never dying, how they'd keep running long after the factory closed down. But it wasn't a joke, was it? I wasn't just hearing things. It wasn't just some glitch in my mind. Something someone had never left. The machines, the hum of the factory, they were all part of it. The factory was haunted, but not in the way I had imagined. The workers, their spirits, their memories, they had become part of the factory, trapped inside the walls, inside the machines, inside the machinery that had once given them purpose. And now I had disturbed them. I could feel it. A sense of inevitability weighed down on me. The figure, this thing in front of me, wasn't just one of the lost workers. It was something more. Something that had taken the factory's hunger and had twisted it into something else. It was feeding on fear, feeding on the loneliness, the desperation of the workers who had never left. My throat tightened as the thought consumed me. I wasn't going to survive this. The thudding behind me grew louder. I wasn't alone anymore. The factory was alive, and it was hungry. I turned toward the darkened hallway, but the shadows stretched farther than before, reaching out toward me, eager, beckoning. The heartbeat from the walls grew stronger, and with it came the slow, deliberate steps of something that wasn't human. I had to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. They were frozen, locked in place by terror. They're watching me, I thought, my breath shallow and ragged. The walls pressed in on me. The air was too thick. I wasn't going to make it. No one ever did. And then the figure spoke. Its voice was low, distorted, but unmistakable. Join us. And I understood. I finally understood. They hadn't just disappeared. They had changed. They had become one with the factory. And I was next. Before I could scream, the shadows surged forward, swallowing me whole. The last thing I felt was cold metal pressing against my skin. And then nothing. Everything went dark. It wasn't the kind of darkness that came with the absence of light. It was something deeper, more suffocating. It was a darkness that seemed to smother you, like it was reaching inside of me, pulling at the very core of my being. My heart raced, my breath shallow and erratic as I was consumed by the black void. The air had become cold, unnaturally cold. It was a cold that sank into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. And then, the sound, the thudding, the heartbeat was no longer just in the walls. It was in my head now. Thump, thump. Each beat was louder than the last, drowning out any thoughts I had left. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. My legs were paralyzed, my arms heavy, as though the very air around me was keeping me rooted in place. I tried to call out, but my mouth wouldn't work. The words never came. I couldn't see anything, yet I could feel them. I could feel the presence of something, somewhere in the dark, just beyond my reach. I could feel eyes on me, cold and unblinking. Waiting. The sensation was so overwhelming, so terrifying, that I felt like I was being torn apart from the inside. The machines. I could hear them. The low, metallic groan of gears shifting, the hiss of steam escaping, the clattering of old parts coming back to life. But it wasn't like before, it wasn't mechanical. This was organic. The factory wasn't just operating, it was breathing. The sound was too real, too alive. And then the whispers started. They were faint at first, just a soft murmur that I could barely make out. But they grew louder, clearer, and with them, a sudden, sharp chill ran down my spine. The voice of Gary was still there, distorted and broken, echoing through the blackness. But it wasn't just Gary's voice anymore. It was them, the lost workers. They were speaking together now. Their voices, twisted by time and decay, filled the empty space around me. Not alone. You're one of us now. The factory never forgets. The words bled into one another, and I couldn't make sense of them. But I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me. They were pulling me in. I could feel them drawing me closer, their voices wrapping around my mind like ropes, tightening, constricting. I tried to shut them out. I tried to block them out, to force myself to move, to run, to scream. But I couldn't. The words, the voices, they kept coming. They were relentless. They were inside my head now, burrowing into my thoughts. My reality began to fracture, the line between what was real and what was imagined blurring beyond recognition. And then something shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint ripple in the darkness. I felt it in my chest, a strange pressure that pushed against my ribs, then my lungs. I gasped, but it only made the pressure worse. My body began to ache, my muscles locking up as if the very air had become thicker, more suffocating. I felt as though I was sinking, being pulled down into the factory itself, like it was swallowing me whole. The heartbeat in the walls grew louder, more frantic. The machines were alive, and they were feeding. Feeding on the lost. Feeding on me. I don't know how long I was there, lost in that endless black void. Time didn't matter anymore. I could no longer tell if I was dreaming or if this was reality. My body had stopped responding, my mind a swirl of fragmented thoughts and memories. And then there was a shift. A sudden sharp noise. A door. A creak followed by the sound of metal scraping against metal. The door, the exit, it had opened. I didn't have the strength to move. I wanted to look to see if someone had come for me. But I couldn't move my head. I couldn't open my eyes. All I could do was lie there in the darkness, feeling the weight of the factory pressing down on me, consuming me. Please. That thought, the last thought I had left, was a desperate plea. But the factory didn't hear it. It didn't need to. It was feeding, growing stronger, pulling me in deeper with every passing moment. And then with a final shudder, everything stopped. The heartbeat, the machines, the voices, all of it stopped. It was as if the factory had inhaled, holding its breath. And I was left alone. Alone in the suffocating darkness, my body numb, my mind fractured. The cold still pressed in around me, but now it felt different, more distant. The weight that had been crushing me was gone. For a fleeting moment, I thought it was over. But then a sound, a quiet whisper, soft, too soft to hear, but there. Welcome. The word echoed in my mind, and I knew then. I was never leaving. The factory had taken me. The factory had claimed me. And now I was part of it. There would be no escape. Not now. Not ever. Because the factory was not empty. And it never would be again. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like, but if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. It started with a simple question that refused to leave my mind. Do you ever feel like the forest is watching you? I've spent most of my career studying forests, isolated in small cabins or tents, surrounded by silence and nature. But this was different. This was Mount Rainier National Park in the heart of Washington State, familiar, yet somehow different this time. My name's Alex, I'm a researcher. I came here to collect samples after reports of strange growths on some trees near Paradise Creek. Nothing unusual at first. Fungus formations, I thought, maybe a parasite infestation. But when I first saw them, I hesitated. They were grotesque, gnarled and twisted knots, pale and strangely smooth. From certain angles, they seemed to resemble faces, human faces. I laughed off the discomfort, trying to stay rational. Nature plays tricks, I reminded myself, yet I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. As I approached one of the trees, my hand touched the cold bark. It felt oddly soft, like skin. A chill crawled up my spine. Suddenly, a faint rustling caught my attention. Probably an animal, but the noise lingered just out of sight, moving subtly through the undergrowth. I turned sharply, scanning the shadows between the trunks. Nothing. But the sensation remained, as if something or someone was watching from beyond the thick branches. The wind shifted, carrying a sickly sweet scent. It reminded me of rot and blooming flowers simultaneously. Strange, confusing, disorienting. I quickly took my samples, slicing carefully through the bark. With each cut, the sensation intensified, as though the forest itself recoiled at my intrusion. My fingers trembled slightly, adrenaline pulsing through my veins. The tree sap oozed out, thick and disturbingly red, staining my gloves. "It's just sap," I whispered, reassuring myself. But in the silence that followed, I heard a whisper, soft, barely audible, yet unmistakably human. "Alive." I spun around, heart pounding. Who's there? The trees stared back silently, faces etched in silent screams. Shadows shifted gently with the evening breeze. I was alone, at least that's what I told myself as I hastily packed my gear. As I walked back to my car, the forest seemed different, darker, denser, oppressive. Familiar paths twisted subtly, appearing alien. My breathing quickened. Rational thought wrestled with creeping panic. Then from the corner of my eye I saw movement, not an animal this time. A shadow too tall, too thin, almost human. I froze. "Just shadows," I repeated softly, barely believing it myself. The feeling intensified. The forest held its breath, watching, waiting. And deep down I knew I was no longer alone. Sleep came reluctantly that night, haunted by unsettling dreams. Visions of the trees danced in my mind, their twisted faces whispering unintelligible warnings. Every shadow in my tent seemed alive, waiting patiently. Morning brought little relief. The samples I'd taken lay beside my sleeping bag. In daylight they appeared normal, almost boring. Yet when I touched them, my stomach churned. Something wasn't right. I stepped outside, the forest quiet but oppressive. No birds sang, no insects hummed. Only the whispering wind moved through branches like faint, mocking laughter. Coffee didn't help. Rationality clung weakly, drowning in persistent unease. I decided to inspect the trees again, determined to find something logical, a scientific explanation to dispel the creeping madness. As I approached, the trees seemed to recognize me, leaning subtly inward as if anticipating my return. I knelt beside the largest tree, running my hand over its bark, smooth, cold, sickeningly flesh-like. Suddenly my heart lurched, a low humming noise vibrated through the earth beneath me. barely perceptible at first, then unmistakable, resonating through my bones. I pressed my ear against the bark, pulse hammering. A heartbeat slow, rhythmic, alive. Impossible, I muttered, pulling back sharply. The humming intensified, growing louder, more menacing. Panic seized me. Trees don't have heartbeats. I stumbled backward, tripping on roots now tangled like grasping hands. My breath quickened. The forest blurred around me, distorted and sinister. I had to get out, but the path I'd taken yesterday had vanished. Thick underbrush and unfamiliar trees surrounded me. Impossible. Paths don't just disappear. I ran, directionless, heart racing. Branches clawed at me, roots tangled my feet, the forest itself resisting my escape. In desperation, I stopped, gasping for air. Then something moved beside me. Slowly, impossibly, one of the tree faces twisted toward me. Bark cracked open with a sickening wet sound, revealing hollow eyes, empty yet somehow aware. "Join us," it whispered, voice dry and brittle. I screamed, terror overwhelming rational thought. I fled blindly, crashing through branches until finally stumbling onto the familiar trail. The forest fell silent again, mocking my retreat, yet the whispers echoed in my ears, clear and haunting. "Join us." Back in my cabin, I locked every door and window, though it felt pointless. The memory of those hollow eyes pursued me relentlessly, burrowing deep into my thoughts. My rational self fought desperately against rising paranoia. I paced the small room, each creak of the floorboards magnified. My reflection in the mirror startled me. A pale, haunted face stared back, eyes wide with fear. "It's stress," I whispered, clinging weakly to logic, sleep deprivation. But logic provided no comfort. Shadows played tricks on my eyes, shapes dancing in peripheral vision. The wind outside murmured secrets, words just beyond comprehension. Exhaustion eventually overcame fear. As I drifted into restless sleep, the dreams returned with vengeance. The forest encircled me, its twisted branches forming faces, whispering incoherent, dreadful things. I felt roots climbing my legs, pulling me underground, burying me alive. I woke screaming, drenched in sweat. Darkness pressed heavily around me, suffocating. The whispering persisted, outside the cabin now, louder, clearer. "You belong here." Gripped by dread, I peered cautiously out the window. Figures moved among the trees, human yet distorted. Faces I recognized, friends, colleagues, people I'd passed on the street, each one staring blankly, mouths silently shaping words. "Join us." My mind fractured. Was it hallucination or reality? I couldn't trust my eyes or my thoughts anymore. Desperation surged within me. I grabbed my phone, no signal. Isolation pressed in mercilessly. I had to confront the source. With trembling hands, I took my flashlight and stepped outside. Cold night air wrapped around me like a shroud. The trees waited silently, faces hidden now but undeniably watching. As I moved deeper into the forest, my footsteps faltered. Every shadow seemed to breathe, every rustle whispered my name. The flashlight flickered weakly, fighting against darkness. Then a sound pierced the silence, a low, dreadful moan resonating through the trees. It pulsed within my chest, each beat echoing the forest's unnatural heartbeat. Panic surged. I turned back, but the cabin was gone. Only endless, twisted forest stretched behind me, trapping me within its dark heart. "Too late," whispered the trees. Trapped, terrified, I fell to my knees. The forest leaned inward, shadows engulfing me, whispering cruelly. "Welcome home." I scrambled to my feet, heart racing uncontrollably. Every breath felt sharp and painful, panic overwhelming rational thought. Around me, darkness shifted, solidifying into figures more grotesque and real with each passing second. Shapes emerged, pale and elongated, neither fully human nor completely tree. Their eyes were empty voids, mouths open in soundless screams. They advanced slowly, methodically, encircling me. "No," I gasped, stepping backward, my flashlight trembling uselessly in my grip. "Yes," whispered a figure nearest me, voice hollow yet familiar, an echo of myself. My pulse thundered in my ears. They closed in tighter, an inescapable circle. Desperation clawed through me, my mind frantic, searching for a way out. But the forest was alive, conscious, its intentions sinister. Suddenly a root burst through the soil, grasping my ankle with a cold, relentless grip. I fell, clawing uselessly at the earth. Another root bound my wrist, then another, immobilizing me. I struggled violently, but the trees only tightened their grip, whispering soothing horrors. "You can't run from yourself." In terror, I saw the faces clearly, twisted reflections of my deepest fears, my worst memories. Each figure bore a familiar expression, mirroring hidden parts of myself I desperately wished to forget. "We are your nightmares," whispered another figure, lining closer. Its breath was cold, rancid, like decay. In a surge of primal fear, I thrashed wildly, breaking free momentarily. Scrambling, I grasped a fallen branch, swinging desperately. It connected with a sickening crack, sending a figure staggering back, but more advanced, relentless. "You cannot escape," they murmured collectively. "I won't become one of you," I shouted defiantly, though my voice cracked with fear. The forest groaned, the trees twisted violently, their faces contorting grotesquely. Branches clawed downward, scraping my skin, drawing blood. Pain surged through me, clarifying my desperation. With one final burst of strength, I lunged through a narrow gap, sprinting blindly. Trees blurred past, branches slashing at me, voices following like echoes of madness. "You will return." Bloodied, exhausted, I crashed through the final barrier of brush into an open clearing. Silence returned abruptly, oppressive and mocking. I turned slowly, dreading what I'd find behind me. The forest stood silently, faces frozen in eternal screams, waiting patiently for my return. Weeks passed, but the whispers never stopped. Even back in the city, faces haunted every crowd, peering at me from reflections, lurking at the edges of my vision. Normal life had become a shadowy existence, my reality frayed. I tried therapy, rational explanations, medication. Nothing silenced the forest's call. The samples I'd taken remained untouched, locked away. I couldn't bring myself to destroy them, as if part of me had already become intertwined with their sinister roots. One evening, driven by sleepless madness, I unlocked the cabinet. The samples lay exactly as I'd left them, quiet yet intensely alive. My pulse quickened as I reached out, fingertips brushing gently against their surface. Instantly the whispers returned, clearer, stronger. "You cannot deny what you've seen." A rush of memories flooded me, fear, isolation, helplessness. But this time curiosity accompanied dread. I realized the truth. The forest hadn't invaded my world, I had entered its hidden realm. Its roots were within me now, deep and irrevocable. I knew I had no choice but to go back. Days later, I stood once more at the edge of Mount Rainier National Park, twilight casting long, shadowed fingers across the ground. The familiar sickly sweet scent greeted me, welcoming me home. The path opened naturally before me, guiding my steps inward. Fear faded into acceptance, dread mingling with an odd sense of belonging. With every step I felt lighter, as though the forest itself drew my burdens away. At the clearing's edge I paused. The trees were silent but aware, waiting patiently. They parted gently, allowing me passage, faces serene, eyes closed in peaceful resignation. In the center, a single tree stood apart. Its face was different, calm, reflective. As I approached, the bark peeled gently back, revealing an empty hollow shaped exactly for me. Hesitation was brief. The whispers were comforting now, promising release from endless torment. I stepped forward, settling into the tree's embrace. Bark folded around me, cool yet gentle, sealing me inside. As darkness enveloped me, peace replaced panic. The heartbeat I'd feared pulsed softly, synchronizing with mine. "Welcome," the forest whispered tenderly. "You're home now." I closed my eyes, surrendering completely, becoming one with the forest. Yet deep inside, a single question lingered. Was I truly safe, or had I willingly embraced an eternal nightmare? But by then, it no longer mattered. Have you ever felt the forest was watching you? My name is Alex Harper, and I'm an environmental researcher for Washington State University. I've always felt at peace among trees, finding solace in their silent presence. But something changed when my team and I entered Olympic National Park that autumn. The day started quietly. Morning fog curled around our ankles like a sleepy animal, reluctant to wake. The air had the usual crispness of a September dawn, cool and scented with pine needles. Yet even then, something lingered at the edge of perception, barely noticeable, like a distant whisper. I brushed it aside, blaming it on restless sleep. "Alex, check this out," said my colleague Jim, crouched near an old cedar. His voice, usually steady and calm, trembled slightly. I walked over, crunching through dry leaves, and followed his gaze. The tree trunk was swollen, gnarled in a bizarre pattern, forming a grotesque, unmistakably human face. The eyes seemed hollow, deep-set, as if carved by an artist driven mad by nightmares. The mouth was twisted into a scream that never sounded. "Looks like the face is staring right at us," Jim whispered, his eyes wide. "It's pareidolia," I muttered, attempting reassurance, though a chill slithered down my spine. "Just your brain seeing patterns." But Jim shook his head, visibly disturbed. He wasn't superstitious, not normally. Today was different. As we moved further into the forest, more faces appeared, one, two, then dozens. Each tree seemed alive, contorted in eternal agony or frozen screams. Some faces were mournful, others furious. I couldn't ignore the eerie sensation that their invisible eyes tracked us. By noon, our group set up a temporary research site. While the team unpacked gear, I caught myself repeatedly glancing toward the forest edge. The faces on the trees had unsettled everyone. Conversations turned quiet, uneasy. "Maybe we shouldn't disturb these," Jim mumbled, examining our tools nervously. "They're just trees," I replied, hearing the hollow echo in my words. Rationality clashed violently with an irrational dread brewing inside me. We began taking samples. As I sawed into one trunk, a faint, high-pitched noise filled my ears. It seemed to rise directly from the tree. I paused, pressing a hand to my ear, startled. "Hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Jim's voice held a forced calmness. "Nothing," I said quickly, resuming the cut. But the noise returned louder, a piercing cry that made my pulse quicken. My saw faltered. My palms grew slick. Later that evening, gathered around the campfire, shadows danced wildly around us, creating shapes that flickered like grasping hands. My stomach twisted, appetite long forgotten. Jim poked uneasily at the fire, eyes fixed blankly into the flames. "I think we upset something," Jim muttered abruptly. His voice trembled. "Trees don't get upset," I insisted, but even as I spoke, my voice wavered, betraying the doubt gnawing at me. Darkness enveloped our camp, thick and oppressive. Wind whispered through branches, carrying sounds of distant rustling. I listened intently, heart pounding. Something felt wrong, dangerously wrong. I imagined eyes glowing, invisible but watchful, staring back from the shadows. Sleep didn't come easily that night. In my tent, tossing restlessly, I closed my eyes, only to see the twisted faces etched in wood. My dreams turned swiftly into nightmares, visions of screaming faces emerging from trunks, mouths gaping, eyes black pits drawing me in. Suddenly I jerked awake. Outside my tent, a soft sound repeated steadily, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, straining to hear, praying it was just a deer or Jim pacing nervously. But no, it was heavier, unmistakably human. My pulse thundered in my ears. Footsteps circled slowly around my tent, stopping occasionally. Each pause felt like an eternity. "Jim," I called softly, my voice shaky. No response. Silence pressed down on me like a suffocating weight. Gradually, the footsteps moved away, fading into the night. Unable to resist curiosity, I unzipped the tent, peering cautiously outside. A chill crept through me. No one was there. Just the trees, dark sentinels looming around the campsite. But now the faces seemed closer, mouths wider, eyes blacker, staring directly at me. I shuddered, retreating quickly inside, locking myself in a cocoon of thin nylon. My mind spun wildly, balancing precariously between rational explanations and creeping terror. What was happening to me? The night stretched on endlessly. Every rustle, every distant snap of a twig sent adrenaline jolting through my veins. I whispered reassurances to myself, desperate to cling to reason. "It's nothing, just your imagination." But deep down, an unshakable feeling grew stronger. This forest wasn't just alive, it was aware. And it didn't want us here. By dawn, fatigue had worn me down. The camp stirred quietly. No one mentioned footsteps or nightmares. Everyone moved sluggishly, haunted eyes cast downward. "You look terrible," Jim noted quietly, avoiding eye contact. "Didn't sleep well," I mumbled. "Me neither," he admitted softly. I kept seeing those faces, even when I closed my eyes. I nodded slowly, understanding exactly what he meant. As morning sunlight sliced through the mist, illuminating rows of twisted faces glaring from every direction, a single thought burned itself into my mind, undeniable and terrifying. This was just the beginning. Days passed, yet our uneasy feeling never lifted. Each sunrise seemed to deepen the dark circles beneath my colleagues' eyes. Conversations became sparse, limited to the barest necessities. Everyone felt it, the heavy, oppressive air of the forest. I noticed how Jim's normally steady hands shook subtly as he cataloged samples. His laughter, once a frequent comfort, had vanished entirely. Now his eyes darted restlessly toward the tree line, wary of something hidden within. "Did you sleep?" I asked one morning, hoping for normalcy. "No," he said, barely audible. "The faces, they come closer every night." In dreams. I knew exactly what he meant. The faces haunted me too, appearing at the edge of vision, blurred yet unmistakably real. Even during daylight, paranoia crept into my mind. We worked mechanically, setting sensors, marking locations, and collecting samples. Yet the forest watched our every move. Leaves rustled unnaturally behind us, branches creaked overhead, mimicking footsteps. Shadows stretched too long, moving subtly when glanced at indirectly. One afternoon, as sunlight dwindled prematurely through the thick canopy, I heard it clearly, a whisper, distorted yet distinctly human. The voice called softly, urgently, drifting from somewhere deep within the trees. "Alex." My blood froze. "Jim," my voice trembled. He looked at me blankly. Didn't say anything. Another whisper, closer this time, sharper. "Alex, come closer." I stumbled backward, pulse racing. "Did you hear that?" Jim's eyes widened, his fear mirroring mine. "Hear what?" We stood frozen, straining our ears. Silence returned, heavy, mocking. That night sleep felt impossible. I stared at the tent ceiling, mind replaying the whisper. Doubt gnawed fiercely. Was the forest playing tricks, or was I losing myself? A sudden rustle snapped me awake from a half-dream. My heart raced uncontrollably. A shadow passed silently by the tent flap, too tall and thin to be human. Breathing shallowly, I peered outside. A figure, elongated and bent, drifted silently between the trees, fading slowly into the forest. My throat tightened. Trees didn't move. Morning brought no comfort. We silently acknowledged the nightmares, but dared not speak aloud, afraid to make them real. "You saw something, didn't you?" Jim whispered later, eyes pleading for honesty. "Yes," I admitted softly, glancing at the grotesque faces encircling us. "But what?" We worked faster, desperation quickening our movements. Yet the faces multiplied, their expressions twisting darker, angrier. "Look at this," Jim shouted suddenly, panic edging his voice. He stood near a large cedar, trembling visibly. I rushed over, heart sinking. Scratched deeply into the bark, fresh and raw, were two words. "Get out." We stared silently, minds racing. Neither spoke, but understanding passed between us clearly. We were not alone. Darkness fell swiftly, bringing chaos. Wind screamed violently through branches, shaking tents, tearing at equipment. Shadows darted through the perimeter, shapes forming and dissolving rapidly. Jim stumbled toward me, eyes wide. "Oh, it's here. It's everywhere." The trees began groaning, a low, resonant sound growing louder. Roots creaked beneath our feet, rising like skeletal fingers. Suddenly Jim screamed, a raw, guttural sound, as roots snaked upward, gripping his ankles, pulling him downward. He clawed frantically at the earth. "Help me," he shouted, face pale with terror. I lunged forward, grasping his arms, struggling desperately. The ground shuddered violently, pulling Jim deeper. Eyes wild, he reached desperately for me. "Don't let go," he pleaded. My voice cracked, muscles burning with effort. Roots twisted upward around my own legs, but I kicked free, fighting desperately. Then suddenly the pressure vanished. Jim collapsed, gasping raggedly. I dragged him upright, half running, half stumbling towards safety. The camp was in ruins, equipment scattered, tents shredded. We stood gasping, shaking, battered but alive. Behind us, the faces stared silently, their expressions shifting slowly into grotesque smiles. "We need to leave," I said, voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight," Jim agreed, eyes haunted, darting around. Gathering what remained, we fled the camp, stumbling blindly through oppressive darkness. Branches clawed at us, tearing skin, clothing. The forest pulsed with anger, alive and seething. Hours passed, disorientation deepening. Finally exhausted, we stumbled onto the main trail, collapsing in relief. But relief vanished instantly. There, lining the trail, were more trees, faces more twisted, more numerous, mouths opened wider, frozen in silent, endless screams. A single thought hammered relentlessly in my mind. We were trapped. Our attempts to leave the forest failed miserably. Paths we knew twisted strangely, leading us deeper into unknown territory. Time lost meaning. My watch stopped, hands frozen at 3:15, eternally mocking our predicament. "We're going in circles," Jim gasped, exhaustion and panic clear in his voice. I felt it too, disorientation pressing upon us like an invisible fog. Every tree, every rock seemed familiar yet alien, mocking our attempts to escape. As night fell again, we reluctantly settled near a clearing, desperate for rest. Silence enveloped us heavily, unnaturally. No wind rustled the leaves, no insects chirped. The forest held its breath. "It feels wrong," Jim whispered, eyes darting restlessly. "Like it's waiting." "For what?" I asked, afraid of his answer. "For us." We barely spoke afterward, ears tuned sharply to every faint sound. The darkness around seemed thicker, heavier. I struggled to remain awake, fearing what nightmares awaited. But sleep eventually overcame me. My dreams were violent, filled with shifting shapes, screams, and the endless faces of trees. Whispered voices pulled me deeper, promising release, tempting me to give in. I jerked awake repeatedly, sweating and terrified. The final time I awoke, the clearing was bathed in dim moonlight. Jim was gone. "Jim," I called hoarsely, panic surging instantly. My voice echoed mockingly, swallowed by the woods. No reply. I stumbled upright, flashlight shaking wildly as I spun, illuminating grotesque faces on every side, mocking grins carved deeply into twisted bark. "Jim," I shouted louder, desperation rising. A faint noise drifted through the trees, a low murmur, indistinct yet human. Heart racing, I moved forward, compelled by hope and dread. "Jim." The voice grew clearer, forming recognizable words. "Help me, Alex." I pushed through thick foliage, branches scratching my face, heart hammering. The voice was unmistakably Jim's, desperate, frightened. "I'm coming," I called, voice trembling. As I stumbled into another clearing, relief turned instantly to horror. Jim stood motionless, facing a massive, ancient cedar. His body trembled violently, feet rooted firmly into the soil. Roots twisted upward around his legs, crawling slowly upward, gripping tighter. "Alex," he choked, eyes wide with terror. I rushed forward, clawing desperately at the vines, tearing skin in frantic attempts to free him. "Hold on, Jim." Roots tightened cruelly, climbing higher, entwining his torso. Jim screamed, a horrifying, primal sound that echoed endlessly. "No," I yelled, fighting desperately. The tree groaned deeply, wood splintering loudly. Faces erupted violently from the bark, mouths agape, screaming silently. "Alex," Jim gasped, voice barely audible. "Run. I won't leave you," I shouted, tears blinding me. But the roots surged suddenly upward, pulling Jim sharply into the tree, absorbing him. His scream ended abruptly, leaving unbearable silence. "Jim," I shrieked helplessly, clawing at the bark. But he was gone. The faces stared coldly, unfeeling, eyes hollow. I stumbled backward, collapsing to the ground, gasping in horror. The forest watched impassively as grief and rage consumed me. "You monsters," I screamed at the trees, voice cracking. In response, whispers rose in chorus, mocking, accusing. "You disturb us. Now we disturb you." I scrambled to my feet, heart thundering with rage and fear. Every face stared, mouths twisting into grotesque smiles. The whispers intensified, overlapping chaotically, battering my mind. Fleeing blindly, I crashed through branches, heedless of direction, driven only by primal instinct to escape. Faces blurred past, screaming silently, mouths gaping, eyes wide in accusation. Exhaustion finally overtook me, and I collapsed, sobbing uncontrollably. I lay curled on the forest floor, despairing, haunted by visions of Jim's final moments. Eventually, silence returned, heavy, smothering. "I'm sorry, Jim," I whispered brokenly. My eyes drifted shut, hopelessness pulling me under. When consciousness returned, dawn had arrived, filtering weakly through the oppressive trees. Numbly I rose, forced onward by a fragile determination. Each step weighed heavily, guilt and grief dragging me downward. Jim's final screams echoed endlessly in my mind. Yet one thought persisted stubbornly. I had to survive. For Jim. But as I moved forward, my horror deepened. Every tree now bore Jim's face, eyes pleading, mouth frozen mid-scream. The forest mocked me cruelly, forcing me to confront my guilt repeatedly. I screamed desperately, covering my eyes, stumbling blindly onward. But the faces never disappeared. They stared relentlessly, accusing, condemning. Trapped within an endless nightmare, I began to question reality itself. Was I losing my mind? Or was the forest truly alive, torturing me with my own worst fears? Either way, escape felt impossible. And the voices, they never stopped. I had lost track of days. My body moved mechanically, driven only by the will to survive. My thoughts were tangled, clouded by grief and terror. Jim's face haunted every tree, endlessly screaming accusations. I stumbled onward through an ever-changing landscape. Paths twisted impossibly, leading nowhere. Familiar landmarks appeared repeatedly, taunting me. Yet something deep within urged me forward, toward an unseen, terrifying heart. Gradually, the forest changed again. Trees became older, massive trunks twisted grotesquely, ancient limbs reaching skyward in desperation. Faces were now distorted beyond recognition, silent screams carved into bark, mouths wide with pain. Each face radiated palpable agony. Whispers now constantly filled the air, hissing through branches like snakes. My name echoed repeatedly, a sinister chant. Alex, Alex. Shivering uncontrollably, I pressed forward, feeling pulled inexorably toward an unknown epicenter of horror. Curiosity warred violently with fear. Rationality screamed warnings, yet my feet continued forward as if guided by something else entirely. Finally, I reached a massive clearing dominated by a single, immense tree, twisted, ancient, grotesque. It towered impossibly high, branches clawing at darkened skies, roots sprawling outward like giant tentacles grasping desperately. I stepped hesitantly closer, heart thundering violently. Hundreds of faces emerged grotesquely from its bark, crowded together in eternal torment, silently screaming, begging for release. I recognized Jim's face prominently among them, eyes wide in endless terror. My stomach churned violently. Jim, I whispered, reaching toward him, grief overwhelming. The tree groaned, a deep rumbling vibration shaking the ground beneath me. Roots trembled, shifting slowly, drawing tighter. Suddenly a voice filled my mind, resonant and powerful. You disturb our sleep. You steal from our flesh. I'm sorry, I whispered desperately. We didn't know. Ignorance excuses nothing, it hissed harshly. Release him, I pleaded, desperation tightening my throat. Please let him go. Too late, it whispered, mocking and cold. He is ours now. The tree shifted again, branches reaching downward menacingly. But you may join him, it whispered, voice deceptively soothing. End your torment. Roots snaked toward me, moving slowly, seductively. Panic surged. I stumbled backward, feet tangled in underbrush. Roots tightened suddenly around my ankles, pulling viciously. No, I shouted, fighting violently. Panic blurred my vision as desperation fueled strength. Grasping a sharp rock, I hacked violently at the thick roots. Sap oozed thickly, dark red like blood. The tree groaned loudly, vibrating angrily. You will not escape, it hissed furiously. I scrambled upward, adrenaline surging. Faces emerged rapidly, expressions contorted in anger, eyes glaring malevolently. Roots whipped outward, slashing viciously, slicing skin deeply. Pain seared through me, yet I fought onward, primal instinct driving each movement. You cannot run from yourself, the tree whispered harshly. We are your fears. Leave me alone, I screamed defiantly, pushing violently through grasping branches. My mind filled rapidly with visions, nightmares, memories, regrets. Every failure, every fear intensified sharply, battering me emotionally, seeking to break me. Jim's final scream echoed endlessly. No, I shouted, voice cracking, tears blinding me. I won't surrender. Suddenly, faces emerged directly in front of me, Jim's most prominently. Eyes wide, mouth gaping in terror. Alex, his voice whispered weakly. Give up. Jim, no, I sobbed desperately, resolve weakening. Join us, whispered countless voices in unison. But something deep within me ignited stubbornly, a primal urge to survive, to resist. Rage surged fiercely. Never, I screamed furiously, striking outward, fists bloodied, voice raw. In response, the tree recoiled sharply, momentarily stunned. Roots loosened fractionally, providing a brief window of escape. Driven by desperation, I bolted, adrenaline-numbing pain, feet moving rapidly, heedless of direction. Whispers chased relentlessly, angered and vengeful. "You cannot escape," echoed relentlessly. Yet I continued forward stubbornly, determination stronger than terror. Visions blurred around me, trees screaming silently in endless agony. Finally, gasping painfully, I collapsed against an ordinary tree, exhaustion overwhelming. The whispers gradually faded, replaced slowly by normal forest sounds, wind, rustling leaves, distant birdsong. Disbelief surged had I escaped. Yet doubt lingered sharply, paranoia gnawing persistently. Was this another trick, another torment? In the distance, through gaps in trees, I glimpsed familiar trails, the entrance to the park. Hope surged fiercely, conflicting violently with suspicion. Slowly, cautiously, I moved forward, heart racing wildly, prepared for deception. But nothing stopped me. No roots grasped my ankles. No whispers mocked me. Emerging finally onto the main trail, familiar yet strangely alien, I stared numbly around. The faces were gone. Yet even as relief tentatively blossomed, unease lingered deeply. The forest had changed me, left a permanent mark. And deep inside I knew it wasn't finished yet. Returning home should have felt comforting, safe. But every night as darkness fell, dread consumed me. Memories from the forest lingered vividly, haunting every quiet moment. Jim's desperate face flashed endlessly before my eyes, pleading silently for release. Weeks passed, yet normalcy eluded me. The world felt wrong, distorted. People appeared strange, faces subtly altered, unsettlingly familiar. Paranoia became a constant companion, whispering incessantly, feeding doubts. One evening, crowded streets pressed heavily around me, anxiety rising sharply. Faces shifted, contorted subtly as if mocking my unease. Eyes watched coldly from shadows, mouths twisting cruelly. "You're losing your mind," I whispered harshly, forcing myself onward. Yet even at home, solitude brought no comfort. Shadows moved restlessly at the edge of vision, whispers drifted softly through empty rooms. I questioned reality continuously, trapped between sanity and madness. Sleep offered no refuge. Dreams returned relentlessly to the forest, grotesque faces mocking endlessly. Voices chanted cruelly, merging into a single horrifying entity. "You cannot escape us." Isolation intensified. Friends distanced themselves, unsettled by my haunted appearance, my paranoia. Desperation grew, leading finally to a painful decision. I had to return to confront the forest, to reclaim myself. Returning felt surreal, terrifying yet oddly comforting. Each step deeper increased both fear and determination. Trees welcomed silently, faces twisted grotesquely yet familiar. "I'm here," I shouted defiantly, voice echoing emptily. The forest remained silent, watchful. "I'm not afraid," I lied forcefully. Branches rustled softly, whispers rising gently like distant laughter. Suddenly, darkness thickened unnaturally, oppressive silence enveloping sharply. A voice echoed, familiar yet alien, resonating deeply. "Welcome back, Alex." Jim stepped forward slowly, emerging impossibly from shadows, unchanged yet profoundly different, eyes cold, face expressionless. "Jim," my voice shook violently. "No longer," he replied coldly, voice distant, emotionless. "We are part of the forest now. You disturbed us. Now you will join." "Never," I whispered defiantly, heart pounding. "You already have," Jim replied evenly. "We're inside you." Terror surged sharply. Roots erupted suddenly, entangling legs, pulling downward violently. I struggled fiercely, panic overwhelming. "You can't fight yourself," Jim stated flatly. His face twisted suddenly, morphing grotesquely, features merging with countless others, becoming a monstrous amalgamation. The creature towered menacingly, whispering voices overlapping chaotically. "You are ours." "No," I screamed, resisting violently. Pain intensified sharply, roots piercing skin, invading flesh. Suddenly clarity struck. This wasn't just physical, it was psychological, spiritual. The forest fed on fear, on regret, on doubt. Summoning every ounce of remaining strength, I confronted the voices inside, the fears, the guilt. "You have no power over me," I shouted forcefully, voice raw with desperation. Instantly, the forest recoiled sharply. Faces contorted painfully, voices screaming, echoing chaotically. The monstrous figure shuddered violently, form destabilizing. "I forgive myself," I whispered fiercely. "I forgive Jim." The creature howled sharply, a cacophony of agony. Roots loosened fractionally, strength flooding rapidly through me. "You cannot exist without my fear," I stated steadily, conviction strengthening. "You cannot escape," it shrieked desperately, form dissolving rapidly. "I already have," I replied calmly. With a final anguished scream, the figure shattered violently, faces dissolving into mist, vanishing instantly. Silence returned abruptly, peaceful, comforting. Slowly, roots released entirely, withdrawing gently. Trees resumed normal appearance, silent sentinels rather than grotesque captors. I stood slowly, breathless, awe and relief overwhelming. The forest watched quietly, no longer threatening. "I'm sorry," I whispered gently, sincerity deepening. "I understand now." A gentle breeze whispered softly through branches, carrying acceptance, forgiveness. Walking slowly toward the forest edge, newfound peace settled deeply within. Fear no longer ruled, replaced gradually by understanding. Emerging finally from the forest, dawn broke beautifully, golden light bathing familiar paths warmly. Relief blossomed fully, genuine and healing. Yet deep inside, awareness lingered sharply. Some nightmares never truly vanish entirely. Scars remained permanently, reminders of battles fought, fears conquered. And as sunlight warmed my face gently, realization deepened profoundly. Life had changed forever. I had faced darkness, confronted myself, and emerged stronger, wiser. Yet glancing briefly backward, shadows shifted subtly beneath trees. Faces seemed briefly visible, watching silently. I smiled softly, accepting fully. They would always remain, shadows following quietly, reminders of the price paid, the lessons learned. And perhaps someday they might finally rest. But until then, I would walk forward, carrying them silently within, no longer enemies, but companions on the journey toward redemption. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.